So Joan Bennett herself wrote a book about Virginia Woolf, but she couldn't think of any 20th century women writers it would be worth my while spending time on. When you think about it, it is rather shocking that Cambridge and Newnham and women went along with this absurd Leavisite great tradition. Actually, if you mention the word Leavis to me now, I bristle, but I didn't dare bristle at the time. Although Leavis himself, of course, he would barely have heard of Rosamond Lehmann and Elizabeth Bowen, so at least Joan Bennett was in advance of him. Even in the women's colleges, we allowed male values to dominate, and we seriously accepted that undergraduates be taught that there were no women novelists worth reading, apart from what Carmen Khalil calls so memorably, the 4 1/4 women writers taught in schools and universities, Austen, the Brontes clumped, Eliot, Woolf, and the white meat parts of Mrs. Gaskell. I know you're laughing, but we also could feel a bit choky about it, but I agree, I'm laughing too, I'm trying to. No wonder Carmen longed to put a bomb under Leavis's amazingly, oh no, she's put agonisingly narrow selection of great novelists. The tendency to claim greatness for the few obscures the rich enjoyment to be found in the many. I believe that so passionately that if you claim greatness for George Eliot and Mrs. Bronte, and the Brontes and Mrs. Gaskell, you're obscuring the rich enjoyment to be found in the many. So many of us felt like this. Why on earth didn't we make more fuss? I feel a bit like that. I feel rather the same about Westway in London, which was built in the late 1960s, and I lived in Islington, my mother lived in Holland Park. And she said, oh, it'd be so much quicker to get to Islington. Why weren't we marching? Why did we allow them to build this totally pointless road? We didn't march. We should have. It's incredible, really. Anyway, we didn't make a fuss. So how was it for Newnham's pre-1960s writers, the writers of the generations before today's writers, some of whom are sitting in the audience, as I've said? It's appropriate that at the launch of our literary archive, we pay tribute to them. And actually, Patricia, if you're going to have any more sessions like this to celebrate the literary archive, I think we should get people to give papers on all Newnham's writers. I'm just going to mention a few. Constance Garnett, the great translator, which is actually a form of writing, as you all know, and Amy Levy came up in October 1979 together. F.M. Mayer came up in 1892, Mary Agnes Hamilton in 1901, Amber Reeves in 1905, Ray Strachey in 1905 as well, Hope Mirrlees in 1910, Frances Partridge in 1918, Elizabeth Jenkins in 1924, Elizabeth Ayrton, the cookery writer, in 1929, Jane Grigson, another cookery writer, in 1946, and Sylvia Plath in 1955. Obviously, I've only chosen writers of the generations before the people writing now. But if anyone is inspired to read 4 novels out of the couple of dozen that, between them, these women have written, I would recommend Amy Levy's Reuben Sachs, F.M. Mayer's The Rector's Daughter, The Tortoise and the Hare by Elizabeth Jenkins, who died a few months ago, aged 104, and of course Sylvia Plath's The Bell Jar. So maybe, Patricia, we could get young Newnham academics to give papers on these writers and these novels in the future. I don't have to tell you, of course, that F.M. Mayer's novel, The Rector's Daughter, was completely forgotten until the 1970s, when the writer Susan Hill was instrumental in its revival. And although The Tortoise and the Hare has been in print on and off for 30 years, it's certainly not seen as a classic, and it should be. In effect, every single one of the writers listed above had a struggle. And it wasn't until the 60s that anything began to change, and then it was slow, even after the publication of Margaret Drabble's The Millstone, which is a novel of hers that has had the most lasting effect on modern women's lives, and we should all reread every 10 years. So we come back to the question of the canon. How do we decide who's in and who's out? Who decides? Who chooses A-level texts, books for university courses? To take another example, at Persephone Books, people write to us every single day suggesting books that should be reprinted. Is it a form of censorship, a form of great traditionship, that we reject most of them? Who is the arbiter of the canon? And what marks a woman writer's success? Is it her being set in universities, her being in lists of top 10 books, or simply her being read and enjoyed? I like to think it's the readers that are the most important. We have a writer called Dorothy Whipple, who most of you won't have heard of. She was extremely popular in the 30s and 40s, then fell completely out of fashion and out of print. She is now our best-selling writer. We have published 6 of her titles, and she is read and hugely enjoyed. And if anybody wants to come into our shop and sit there and eavesdrop every single day of the week, somebody comes in and says, I love Dorothy Whipple. Try to get an academic to read Dorothy Whipple, you'll have a hard time. It would be unthinkable for her to be mentioned in a university. However, we know that Ivy Compton Burnett, who is allowed to be mentioned in universities, loved Dorothy Whipple. She got her books out of Harrods Lending Library, but she hid them under a pile of more intellectual reading when she had visitors. So when I said to her biographer, Hilary Spurling, did you know that Ivy Compton Burnett loved Dorothy Whipple? It's a 2-volume biography, but Hilary has never heard of Dorothy Whipple and didn't know this. Well, I think that's quite a significant detail. By the way, Ivy Compton Burnett herself is a case in point, because when my parents were buying novels for Christmas, Ivy Compton Burnett was widely read, rather like Iris Murdoch. Ivy's younger contemporary, Elizabeth Taylor, was ignored. Now Ivy is barely in print, and I don't think Iris Murdoch is hugely in print, though I may be wrong. And nearly 40 years after Ivy, almost all of Elizabeth's books are widely available. Now that is reader power, I think. So the test of whether women writers survive is not academic recognition or a feminist filter, but it's reader recognition. Alan Lane had to make sure he had 5 women writers in his first 10 Penguins, and he chose Dorothy Sayers, Agatha Christie, E.H. Young, Mary Webb, and Susan Ertz. It's just a pity his choices were so feeble.
I resent that.
I know. I'm being controversial because it will cause a good discussion. I would never have chosen Mary Webb or Susan Ertz, and I might just have chosen E.H. Young, but I always find her rather wet. I would have chosen Dorothy Sayers and Agatha Christie. Then along came, along came the feminist publishing houses, and I am proud to say that Virago and Persephone in its small way have created a new kind of canon. They celebrate writers who are long dead, mostly women writers, we do have a few men, but mostly women, who are long dead and long out of print, but they turn them into writers that people are actually reading. I would argue that this is a far more robust new canon than that imposed by academics, feminism, or any other kind of special pleading. We ought to create a canon by balancing reader power and excellence, not by imposing a concept of a great tradition. It's a subtle balance. Who decides what's excellent? And how to persuade readers who are a little slow to follow a publisher's good judgment in that they fail to buy a book which a publisher thinks is a unique classic, but the readers clearly don't. I'm thinking here of our novel in verse, Lettice Delmer. Nobody buys it. You're all idiots. It's completely wonderful. It's our worst seller. So that's a very interesting case in point. Who is right, the committed publisher or the indifferent reader? Sometimes publishers strike lucky and the readers quickly see the point of a forgotten book. I'm thinking of Alone in Berlin last year, which I think took Penguin by surprise because they hadn't, but in a good way. Sometimes it doesn't happen. I also think with despair that the majority of PhD theses on women writers are still far too often about Virginia Woolf, and otherwise on a narrow focus that allows Catherine Mansfield, Rebecca West, and only a few other permitted writers. This is slowly changing, but it's very slow. And I'm proud to say that the two of the young women who worked at Persephone in the last couple of years have gone off to do PhDs, one on Virginia Woolf, but the other on one of our authors, Betty Miller, who had never been written about before, since her death in '65, that is. But now there have been 3 recent academic papers about her, and soon there will be a PhD, which is a great triumph. Now, we're going to have a discussion about some of these issues, but I want to turn you back to the tea table via Catherine Mansfield. This is Catherine writing to John Middleton Murray in 1913, at the time when she was publishing her early stories. The house seems to take up so much time. So often this week, I've heard you and Gordon talking while I wash dishes. And after you have gone, I walk about with a mind full of ghosts of saucepans and Primus stoves, and you calling, whatever I am doing, Tig, it's 5 o'clock. Isn't there going to be tea?